but I'll keep it to 10 minutes, I promise. Now that I'm a big shot famous person and travel around a lot, I picked up stories from around the country, and I was visiting Bremerton, Washington, this little parish out in the middle of nowhere, and Matthew Abide came to pick me up, and he picked me up in his truck, and on the way to the parish, he said to me, you know, Father, I had a vision, and I groaned inwardly because Benedictines don't have visions, like Franciscans have visions, Passionists, Carmelites, but Benedictines, we don't go in for that kind of stuff. But I was stuck in the truck with him, so I had to listen to his vision. And he said to me, he said, Father, I imagined that I was in the Garden of the Apocalypse, and the dragon turned up. He said, so I grabbed a flaming sword, and I went running toward the dragon. He said, and St. Peter stepped out and said, give me that sword. What are you doing? Here, take these pruning shears. Go prune your corner of the garden. I will take care of the dragon. So I've been telling everybody about Matt Abide's vision because I personally can get so wound up in all the dragons. You know, which Supreme Court justice are we going to get, or what is Senator so-and-so going to do? Of course, there are people like Mr. Lee who actually do have to worry about that stuff. But for me, it's just about pruning my little corner of the garden. And I think that's exactly what Our Lady's Inn does. It isn't to go make big world-changing moves, but to save one little life at a time, to save one woman at a time. About 2 years ago, in an interview with Elle magazine, hey, you get on talking. No, it's fine if it's more interesting. About 2 years ago, in an interview with Elle magazine, Senator Gary Peters claimed in an interview that his then wife, he has a new wife now, of course, underwent an abortion 30 years ago, and she nearly died based on politics, he said. In the late 80s, his then wife, Heidi, was in the 4th month of her pregnancy when her water broke, leaving the baby without an amniotic fluid sac, without any fluid. The doctor recommended an abortion, but because he said the child had no chance at survival, but hospital policy prohibited the procedure, the doctor told her the situation was dire. This article in Elle magazine said she could lose her uterus in a matter of hours if she wasn't able to have an abortion straight away. And if she became septic from the infection, she could die. To make a long story short, Peter's wife got to another hospital and had the abortion. And he says if it weren't for the urgent and critical medical care, she could have lost her life. Now, I'd like to counter that with a very similar story. It will never get the sort of circulation that Elle magazine has, but maybe you can tell it to someone someday. I have a friend who has 3 children, 3 kids, 3 girls. And about 20 years ago, and 16 weeks pregnant, my friend's water broke. Ultrasound revealed that the amniotic sac was completely shattered. There was no more fluid around the baby. She was told that she would go into labor within the next 48 hours, and there looked to be amniotic bands within the womb. These pieces of tissue would begin to wrap around the baby's limbs and amputate them. She was then sent home for a 2-day after a 2-day hospital stay with the instructions to return weekly to have an ultrasound so that they'd know when the baby was dead. Weeks passed and still she had not gone into labor. At this point, the doctors became adamant that she should, in the chillingly antiseptic words of the business, terminate the pregnancy. The diagnosis was that the baby, they told her, was severely mentally handicapped and physically handicapped, would in fact be born with no lungs. A second doctor informed my friend that there was less than a 1% chance of the baby's survival. She also, the doctor was a woman, said that the baby had severe club feet and told her, I quote, "You have a moral duty to finish what God has started." 5 different doctors told her to terminate the pregnancy. What they told her was that this child was a threat to her life. What's more, they assured her that the child was already mentally and physically worthless. Even if it could be brought to term, they assured her it would die in her arms. Even if it could survive delivery, it would be crippled and profoundly mentally disabled. Have an abortion, they told her. One doctor even set up an appointment for her without her wishes, against her wishes. Do it now, the doctor said, taking her by the arm. Put a period at the end of this sentence. So much for pro-choice. When my friend broke the news to her husband, When my friend broke the news to her husband, this is what he said. How lucky for this child that she could be born into a family which could love her for who she is. What family better than ours to raise a disabled child? I told my friend her husband gets to leave the toilet seat up for the rest of his life. For 2 months, my friend lived with the knowledge that she would, at best, bear a child who would die in her arms. She decided, sorry, I get a little choked up when I read this. She decided to name the child Mary. In the meantime, she prayed, and her husband prayed. And Rachel, who was Mary's older sister, she prayed too. She didn't entirely understand what was going on, but she knew her sister was in trouble. And I wonder sometimes if perhaps it was the profound innocence of those prayers that reached into the great well of God's grace and extracted a miracle. At the 25th week of her pregnancy, another ultrasound revealed something extraordinary. "We need to call the Pope," said the doctor. Not only had the amniotic sac resealed itself, but all the fluid returned. He called in all the interns, all the nurses, the assistants, random people standing in the hallway. The amniotic bands had disappeared. The baby was in perfect health. By now, a few of you have guessed that I'm talking about my sister. Jessica Decker is her name. And Mary Decker, the miracle baby, is now a 19-year-old honor student at the University of Kansas City Medical Center studying to be a pediatric surgeon. So what is it that gives us the power to do this, to make these choices? Well, I would propose the Eucharist. I think it's our only weapon against these great forces of evil. A few years ago, in fact, I was reading with my students the story of the birth of Dionysus. It's probably not dinner conversation. But Persephone, the legend goes, was impregnated by Zeus, and she asked to see him in his true form. But see, a finite creature can't look upon an eternal being and live. So the mere sight of Zeus caused Persephone to explode right there and then on the spot. And one of my students asked me why we didn't explode when we received the Eucharist. And I told him I didn't know, but it couldn't hurt to be prepared. Every day, in every Catholic church around the world, a great miracle is worked. The greatest miracle in the history of the world. The creator of the universe is incarnate on the altar, and we are invited to approach that altar and take him in our hands, if we dare. There are some who argue, and convincingly, that we shouldn't dare to walk up and grab the Eucharist as though it were a theater ticket or a drive-through order. There are others who argue, and convincingly, that the human hand makes a worthy throne for so humble a God. But either way, we should be prepared. Now, in 2018, that's 2 BC, before coronavirus, I visited the Tower of London with my parents. We stood in line for an hour and a half to see the crown jewels. An hour and a half. First, we were issued tickets, then we sat through a documentary video, then we were ushered through a winding series of velvet and satin and woven gold and fur and ropes and suits of armor, until at last we were granted a brief glimpse of the crown through bulletproof glass over the shoulders of armed guards. And all that just to see a queen's crown. And there is something infinitely more precious, more powerful at every Catholic Mass. We should be prepared. We should be trembling. Mobs of Christians should be fighting for a glimpse of this miracle. So where is everybody? In 2020, our bishops decided to lock the doors of every church. They forbade us, they forbade you from witnessing this miracle in person. And were we outraged? Were we scandalized? There were riots, I remember, but not over that. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't blame the bishops. They too were acting on the very best medical advice. But how many letters did they receive, I wonder, begging them to have courage, to trust that we'd rather die than be deprived of this miracle? I don't remember hearing about the outrage, but then I was busy hiding in the cloister, sterilizing countertops and doorknobs. What would you give to have been at the wedding feast at Cana when Jesus worked his first miracle? What would you give to have been there on that first Holy Thursday night? Or to have stood at the foot of the cross, to have comforted Our Lady? Well, you can. You've been invited. Be prepared. You're welcome. I'm proud to say that St. Anselm Parish has no cry room. I love it when a screaming kid interrupts my sermon, because we do not fear our children in the Catholic Church. They are holy and they belong in holy places. It's their church too. We are an incarnational faith. The Eucharist is what saves us from Luther's heresy, that we are only mounds of manure covered by snow. His flesh, Christ's flesh, is in our flesh. His blood courses through our veins. This Eucharist is what gives us the power to overcome all evil, gives us God's own strength. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.